Hi there, this is Sam Flegal, and I'm discussing my work for the illustrated Hávamál. This is part 2. Back in part 1, I explained how I created the ink blobs that I'll use to inform my ink drawing. Here in part 2, I'm going to discuss how I create the final ink drawing. Here you can see the ink blobs and how they transition into what will become the final ink drawing. I've recently started trying out a new brand of ink that I really like, Dr. P.H. Martin's Black Star Waterproof India ink. I particularly go for the matte version, which makes it a little easier to scan without getting any sort of a gloss or shiny effect that some inks have. In part 1, I read the full verse from the Hávamál, verse 111, and so now, using that verse to inspire me, I've gone in to find the shapes. You can see there's pencil marks all over the ink blobs, and this is how I let myself find certain shapes. I might see an eye or a face or something that inspires me. This is a great way to explore before going into ink, as ink is very permanent. The first things I knew I wanted to tackle were the three Norns interacting with the Well of Fate. And you can see I've fully developed the Norns, and then I moved on to describe the chanter. The line opens up, "It is time to chant from the chanter's stool, by the well of earth I was." And so here we have the chanter. And so to me, this signifies not just the beginning of speaking, but the beginning of a ritual, specifically the beginning of a very important ritual, that of sumbel, where wise words are spoken over a horn. To me, one way to signal the beginning of a ritual is with drums. Drums are used by tribal cultures throughout human history, and the Scandinavian cultures, those Germanic people, were no different than any other. And to this day, drums are a significant part of many rituals. Now you'll notice that the three Norns are all interacting with water going into the well, and two of them are actually holding horns. This is also a significant part. Now I mentioned the ritual of sumbel. Sumbel is the most ancient pagan ritual that we actually have clear records of how it was conducted and what it was done. I will post an article for those interested in learning more about sumbel in the notes below here on the YouTube video. But the simple version is that the horn was passed around a group of people and words were spoken over the horn. Specifically, it's believed that when you speak words over the horn in this fashion at sumbel, you're entering them into fate. You're saying them over the well of earth. And so that is what our chanter is doing. They're beginning the sumbel, they're beginning the saying of wise words, which is why it was so important to me to use the horns as symbols in this piece. In an earlier iteration, if you look actually back at the pencil drawing, you may notice that the chanter was actually holding a horn once upon a time. And that was my initial idea. But as I started looking at the ink blobs and what was happening in those figures, it just seemed like something more active than holding a horn was happening. So I decided to dig in a little bit and come up with something else, which eventually led me to the idea of the chanter holding a drum. I discussed in part 1 that the well of earth, the well of the Norns, is at the base of the world tree. So that lets me do something I love, and that's draw a tree, ink a tree, paint a tree. There's lots of trees throughout my work. I love organic shapes. And part of it is just they're just so freeing, which then allows me to really follow the ink blobs and create roots and gnarly shapes and interesting little knots. And so it becomes very informative. This is actually one of my favorite parts. Dealing with figures at any time, even when following the shapes that I see, it's a little more nerve-wracking because people can be, when they see a figure that's wrong, they're very critical. And so people are going to be very critical and just say, I don't know, it doesn't seem quite right. But with the tree, you can really do just about anything. It's kind of like Bob Ross at that point. It's your world. You can do what you want. And what I want to do is paint a bunch of roots, apparently. So anyway, it's a lot of fun. You can see, as I build up, just laying down the ink, I'll use different pressures of the brush to get different widths and sizes of the line. Very delicate in order to get a thin, or you can go thick. And I can even make shapes where I press down on the brush and then lift up lightly, and that's how you get that sort of feather look where it goes thick to thin almost immediately. Now, this was a really fun moment. This wasn't so much something I planned, but as I looked at the ink blobs, I saw an eye in the tree. There was like this eye looking out, which led me to Odin, the one eye looking out of the tree. The tree of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and Odin are forever linked, both in symbolism and in mystery. Odin hung from the world tree. One of Odin's bynames means that he's the rider of the world tree. There's a lot of good connection. There's also been some good research that Odin is the world tree, the manifestation of the world tree. There's things that other authors have handled far better than I would, but needless to say, if it's something you're interested in, there's a lot of research to be done on the topic. But for my purposes, it's a symbol that I can come back to, and that's what I'm dealing with here is using symbols to show words, to dig into the poetry. So I love the idea of this eye appearing in the tree and growing out of the tree, which then lead me to maybe there's a nose in the tree, maybe the roots grow up and are sort of the beard or the mustache of the tree, and just keep pushing that symbolism as far as I can take it, and while following the ink blobs as well, letting that be my guide and dig in a little bit to that subconscious art where I'm not trying to overthink what I'm doing. I see something, I react to it, and then I just let that flow, I let that come out. After laying in all the tree details and putting in those limbs, I'll come back into the eye in order to add detail there. Now I do want to say, even though most of the stuff is informed by the ink blobs, I will occasionally still use reference, but it's not as intensive as the reference I use in my other work. Mostly just a simple shot of me holding something or a quick reference of a face or an eye. Once I've got the basic inks laid in, I'll then go back in with a layer of gray tone. That's created by watering down the ink to create a wash. And I do that to add volume to places, to add little bits of detail and shadow now that I know what it is I'm going for. And I've sped this process up because you kind of need to see the whole thing, but you don't need to see the exact detail. It's not like I'm making really precise brush strokes. I'm just laying in that gray tone just as quickly as I can. And once I finish with the gray tone, I'm going to use Dr. P.H. Martin's Pen White in order to start adding little whites over the top of the dried gray tone and the inks. This allows me to add volume to things. In most basic level, it's very much like an eraser for inks, where if I really screw something up, I can go in and touch it up. But here I'm not using it for touch-ups. I'm using it to add those little highlights to the various areas. Here focusing on the roots, but you'll also get to see that I use it to bring out the work of important areas as well. I may use it to outline a figure or something important. And basically it's just a great way to draw the eye, to clean up the illustration, and to add another level of detail. Here's a good example of just carefully taking the white and the brush to outline the figure's leg. I'll do that again on the back leg as well, and you can immediately see the level of pop, the level of emphasis that it adds to those areas. And here it is again, the final illustration from top to bottom, from ink blobs to ink to white. There's the ink blob, and here's the final illustration. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more about the illustrated Hávamál, search for the illustrated Hávamál on Kickstarter or follow this link. If you'd like to see more of my work, all themed around Norse lore, please go to fatefulsigns.com. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe.